All right, I'm not someone who's ever believed in ghosts. Even growing up, I'd always brush off scary stories as nothing but make-believe. But what I'm about to tell you, it changed everything. It's been years, and yet, I still can't shake the feeling of dread whenever I even think about it. This all happened about 5 years ago in a small, nearly forgotten town called Chestnut Grove. My best friend, Andy, had just inherited a rundown house there from his great-aunt, a big, creaky old Victorian that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. It had been abandoned for nearly a decade, the kind of place everyone in town would whisper about, claiming it was haunted. Andy didn't believe in any of it, though, and since we both had a couple of weeks off from work, he convinced me to go down there with him to fix the place up. "It'll be like one of those home renovation shows," he said, laughing. So we packed up, grabbed a few tools, and made the long drive out to Chestnut Grove. The house was even creepier in person, 3 stories tall with narrow windows and an overgrown lawn that looked more like a graveyard than a garden. As soon as we stepped inside, we could smell the stale, musty air. Dust covered everything, and the walls had this eerie, faded wallpaper that seemed to peel off in long, jagged strips. But that wasn't the worst part. Not even close. The first night was when I realized something was off. We'd been working all day, cleaning out the old furniture, moving debris and covering cracks. By midnight, we were dead tired, so we both crashed in separate rooms. The house was so quiet, you could hear a pin drop. I remember lying there, staring at the cracked ceiling, thinking how eerie it felt to be in that house. Around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone was pacing outside my room. I figured it was Andy, probably struggling to sleep just like me. So I called out to him. "Andy?" I whispered, but there was no answer. The footsteps stopped, and I waited, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. The silence felt thick, pressing down on me like a weight. I chalked it up to nerves and tried to fall back asleep, convincing myself it was nothing. The next day, Andy mentioned hearing footsteps too, but he shrugged it off, saying it was probably just the old house settling. We both laughed about it, but something in his eyes told me he was just as freaked out as I was. But that was only the beginning. Over the next few days, things got weirder. We'd hear whispers late at night, barely audible, like someone was speaking right in our ears. Both of us kept seeing things out of the corner of our eyes, shadows darting across the room, reflections in mirrors that weren't our own. One night, I was in the kitchen making a cup of coffee, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled over me. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand touch the back of my neck. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Just empty air and that thick, heavy silence. I tried to laugh it off, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The worst of it happened on our final night there. It was just past midnight when we heard a loud crash from the basement. Now, up until then, we'd avoided the basement. The door was locked, and neither of us could find the key. But that night, the door was wide open, as if something wanted us to go down there. Andy looked at me, his face pale. "You want to check it out?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I wanted to say no, but something compelled us forward. We grabbed flashlights and started down the narrow staircase. The air was freezing, and the smell of damp earth hit us hard as we descended. The basement was pitch black, with only our flashlights piercing the darkness. Halfway down, I noticed something written on the walls in what looked like faded red paint. Words like "leave" and "help" were scrawled all over the walls, overlapping and tangled together, as if whoever wrote them was desperate. That's when we saw her. At the far end of the basement, just beyond the reach of our flashlights, a woman stood, her figure barely visible. She was wearing a long, tattered dress, her head tilted down, her hair covering her face. I froze, my flashlight shaking as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. "Ma'am?" I stammered, my voice barely audible. But she didn't move. Then, slowly, she lifted her head, her face pale and hollow, her eyes sunken and black. She opened her mouth as if to scream, but no sound came out, just a suffocating silence that pressed against us from every side. I felt a chill crawl down my spine as she took a step toward us, her bare feet dragging across the floor, leaving dark stains in her wake. Andy grabbed my arm, snapping me out of my trance. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind us. We didn't sleep that night. As soon as daylight broke, we packed our things, left the house, and never looked back. We were already halfway down the driveway, throwing our bags in the car, when we both noticed that the basement door was wide open again. Neither of us had touched it after slamming it shut that night. The open door seemed to pull us back, daring us to take one last look. "Maybe we should check to make sure it's locked for good," Andy muttered, though I could tell he was just as terrified as I was. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We went back inside, creeping toward the basement door. The house felt even colder now, as if it had been drained of any warmth. We took the stairs down, slowly, every creak echoing in the oppressive silence. The basement was darker than before, like the shadows had deepened, thickened, until even our flashlights barely cut through them. And there she was again, standing in the far corner, but closer now, only a few feet away from us. Her head hung down, her hair matted and stringy, covering her face. I wanted to turn and run, but something held me there, as if her very presence had frozen me in place. Then she began to move. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her head, and that same hollow face stared back at us, those dark eyes empty yet filled with something unspeakable. Her mouth opened again, wider than should have been possible, as if unhinging, and this time a low, guttural moan escaped. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, something ancient and filled with a pain beyond understanding. Andy grabbed my hand, his grip tight, and whispered, "We need to get out of here." But as we turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut above us, trapping us inside. The temperature plummeted and we could see our breath fogging in the frigid air. I felt something cold and sharp graze my arm, and when I looked down, there were red marks, handprints, appearing on my skin as if someone invisible was holding on to me. The lights flickered, and suddenly, she was right in front of us, her face inches from mine. Her skin was cracked, pale as bone, her mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. Her hand reached out, touching my face, and I felt a deep, consuming cold spread through my body, like she was draining the life out of me. Desperate, I pushed away, grabbing Andy, and together we lunged for the stairs. We pounded on the door, screaming, but no one was around to hear us. We were alone with her, trapped in the dark, suffocating silence of that cursed basement. Just when I thought it was over, the door creaked open on its own. Without a second thought, we scrambled out, bolting up the stairs and slamming the basement door behind us. We didn't stop running until we were outside, throwing ourselves into the car. I barely had time to look back, but when I did, I saw her figure standing in the window, watching us leave. As we sped away, the house seemed to darken, its shadows stretching out toward us, almost as if it were reaching for us one last time. We never returned to Chestnut Grove, but every now and then in the dead of night, I feel that same icy touch, and I hear the faint echo of that horrific guttural moan. And sometimes, when I glance in a mirror, I swear I can see her, standing just behind me, waiting. We thought leaving the house would be the end of it. But 2 days after we got back home, strange things started happening. It was subtle at first, a flicker in the lights, doors opening on their own, that faint scent of damp earth following us wherever we went. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, that we were both still rattled by what we'd seen. But deep down, I knew she hadn't let go. One night, I was lying in bed when I felt the familiar, bone-chilling cold wash over me. My breath fogged in front of me, and the room filled with that smell, like the basement at Chestnut Grove. My stomach twisted as I heard a soft, scraping noise coming from my bedroom closet. Frozen with dread, I watched as the closet door slowly creaked open. And there, in the darkness, was the unmistakable shape of the woman. She was crouched, her limbs bent at odd angles, her face half hidden in shadow, but with those empty, hollow eyes staring straight at me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. She crawled out of the closet, dragging herself across the floor, closer and closer, until her icy hand reached up and touched my leg. The cold shot through me, so intense that it burned, and her face twisted into a grotesque smile. Just as she leaned closer, whispering something in a language I couldn't understand, I bolted upright, screaming. The room was empty and the closet door was shut. I haven't slept since. Every night, I see her out of the corner of my eye. She's waiting, patient, creeping ever closer. And I know, deep down, that she won't stop until she's dragged me back to Chestnut Grove. Or worse, until she's here for good.